Who Jacob Harris was is sort of the quest in the book, and I'd love to be able to give you a straightforward answer that he was born in this place at this time. This is what he did in his life. What I've been able to put together, and as part of the book, is the mystery of that and how people have reinterpreted over centuries, is that it seems that he was born in about 1700. So he was in his early 30s when the one thing that we know he did for certain, which is to kill three people by slitting their throats in a remote pub in Ditchling Common in Sussex. That's what we do know about him. But from all the other bits of evidence, it seems that he was almost certainly born in England, and as I am almost certain that he was Jewish, that he would have been in London in a community that was German Jewish, which was a small subcommittee, a subgroup of a not particularly large group of Jews, 1,000 Jews in England in 1700. Of those, only 100 are of German Jewish origin. So he's part of a section of a very small minority. And that from the evidence, it seems that he probably came to Sussex, as most Jews leaving London did, initially as a peddler, which was how many provincial Jewish communities through the 18th century were formed, but very soon becomes a smuggler. And that is what makes him particularly remarkable, not just his crime, but that he is integrated into a very close-knit community where trust and knowledge, local knowledge, is so important. So it's a remarkable case of sort of radical assimilation of a Jew of German origin. It's been said that there is no innocent deposit in archives, and this project showed that every source that I look at, and in some ways I was lucky, that there are fragments of materials which brought together tell a really interesting story. But each one has to be looked at very, very carefully. So one of the perhaps easier sources was the Assizes record, this sort of official record of his capture and his punishment. And that gives you basic details. Even that gives you a little bit more. It tells us that Jacob Harris is also known to him and gives his own name as Herschel Hirsch, which shows his Germanness and also his German Jewishness. So that's Jews did not have surnames until the early 18th century. So the name of Hirsch, which means deer in German, makes an interesting thing that he is already two different things. So the Assizes record is interesting. Newspapers are interesting, though they copy from each other as if there was no plagiarism approach then. They just literally would take big chunks. One newspaper report refers to him with another name of James Daves, which is Daves is a very old English surname. So again, that radical assimilation, but also refers to him as the Jew Daves. So we have one source from an unusual source, a newspaper that only focuses on crime and probably went to the trial, which would have been a very brief trial, probably half an hour, very most probably 10 minutes, very, very different to today. So there's the newspaper accounts. There is also a diary, which is very brief, so brief that in the Victorian age they decided to rewrite it to make Jacob Harris who they wanted to be, a nasty foreign Jew. But in fact, the diary doesn't say that at all. It just gives you the date of when the murder happened. It's from a landowner who's about 2 or 3 miles away. So this has been a huge moment, three murders in one incident. And then it also tells about the gibbeting, the putting in a metal cage of the body that had already been hanged where the scene of the trial was, which is Horsham, about 20 miles away. So that's another very important source. And then there is an intriguing document, which is much harder to deal with, but I think was very, very important, which is the Ballad of Jacob Harris, or the Ballad of Jacob Hirsch, which is, I've now shown to my own satisfaction, was written at the time and would have been written almost certainly for the gibbeting, which would have been a massive sort of fair. Again, for our eyes, this seems horrible. Why would you go and watch someone being put in a metal cage and then have all the things of the fair around you? But people would have sold a song which was hastily constructed, the beginning and the end of very standard murder ballads, and then the bit in the middle is taken from the lead newspaper report, so it shows to me that it's contemporary. What is really frustrating is that in the versions that survive into the 20th century, because there's no original copy, one describes him as a Jew rogue and the other one just as a rogue. And rogue does not have positive connotations as it might do today. So all of these sources, there's also a sort of bill that the County of Sussex send to the Treasury to say, look, this is what it's cost. It cost a lot of money to imprison him, bring him back to be identified, hanging, the judges coming from London, and then the gibbeting itself, and the metal cage would have had to be constructed by a local blacksmith. And so every item is listed. So put them all together and query each one, we can bring a picture. In not one of those does Jacob Harris speak, and that is one of the things that makes this book both frustrating to research, but fascinating to what can you do when you have this intriguing figure who doesn't leave one word for posterity. I think I was surprised about the integration of Jewish pedlars to some extent, but particularly Jewish criminals. So in London itself, what we see as a sort of fraternity of and it is mainly, but not exclusively male, people who are committing small crimes, committing huge crimes, and that they're working together. Sometimes they've got allocated roles. And I suppose the thing that surprised me most, because I was expecting, an outside Jew committing this horrendous crime, especially as two of his victims were women, one probably a younger female who was the maid, and then the wife of the publican where the murder was committed in this pub, who was ill. So it's not a particularly pleasant set of murders. And I thought he was going to become a sort of folk devil, that there would be accusations of ritual murder and so on. In fact, I suppose this is the thing that surprised me most, that Jacob Harris becomes a folk hero, and that the spot today is still known where he was gibbeted, where the gibbet post was put in and holding the cage, is still known as Jacob's Post. It's not Richard Miles, who was the first victim, it's his post. And there's all sorts of folk magic was associated with it in the 18th and 19th century, both the gibbet post and the body. And so this is sort of an identification with the villain, which I was not expecting. And we see other occasions where that there is a sort of integration. So in some ways, there was less anti-Semitism than I was expecting. I was also wondering, very early on, was he in fact a victim of a miscarriage of justice? Was it anti-Semitism, that he was totally innocent? And there are still a few people that think that's the case. I am absolutely certain that he did it, that the first victim, Richard Miles, identifies him and when he's dying, and someone who had killed his wife, why would he sort of say, and he knows he's only got a few days left, why would he say it was him rather than someone else? This is not to deny that there wasn't serious anti-Semitism in the 18th century, sometimes quite brutal, horrendous attacks on Jews and on Jewish pedlars. But overall, I think there's more integration in the 18th century than I was expecting. There are certainly challenges, and I do feel a sense of triumph that this book, which has sort of Jacob Harris running through it. So it looks at how he's remembered at different times, and his image does change, including up to the 21st century. But it also looks at many other Jewish pedlars and criminals and people who were both. And these are ordinary people, maybe have done some extraordinary things, but uh, there are major challenges of recreating the lives. But I do feel that, I have got as close to my main figure and the other figures as is possible. So that, and why do this? I think it's because there are so many more of these are the ordinary Jews and the ordinary non-Jews that they are mixing with, whereas the elite, say Jewish philosophers, they are the exception, and they don't necessarily tell you very much about ordinary Jewish life or ordinary responses to Jews. So I think there is a much richer figure, a picture created through my approach. And yes, it is challenging. You've got to find every scrap of evidence. You've got to be very creative. And I've used uh, quite a lot of folklore in a critical way. Again, not just taking it as read, but sort of how is that the image of Jacob Harris and the things that we don't know but have been assumed in folklore. What can we do with them? So I think it gives a much richer picture, and it essentially makes these people more interesting rather than the great and good, who often live quite boring lives. I think there's one that is sort of close to home in the sense that it was one of my distant relatives, my great grandfather, and it was a story that I knew a tiny bit about because when I was 12, I was in the equivalent of Sunday school in the Cheder. We were told to interview our relatives, and I interviewed my grandmother, and she told me about her father, and she said that he imported eggs from Egypt, and I thought this is she would never tell anything that was untrue, but also I thought she just got it wrong. And then I lost my notes, and then my mum died about 15 years ago, and I found my notes again. It was a wonderful, embarrassing in some ways of my sort of childish handwriting, which hasn't improved. But it was, so I thought, let's do some work on this. And the story became richer. He naturalized, so he became a British citizen. And that provided a huge amount of evidence about his everyday life in Hull, where he'd come from Russia. And he'd started out as a peddler. And then a group of them, both English and foreign, Jewish and non-Jewish, in Hull, started importing eggs from Egypt. And this, to me, again, sounded crazy, but there was a very small domestic production of eggs, and usually it was in the countryside for local use. Most of the eggs came from the Baltic. Oh, in the winter, the Baltic froze over, and so Alexandria in Egypt, where a lot of egg production was taking place, became another market. So my great grandfather, Samuel Gordon, was one of these. Now, that was interesting enough, and then to realize this was a huge trade. There are hundreds of millions of eggs were being brought in. You think, well, low value, very vulnerable to a very long journey, but in fact, it was successful. My great grandfather was slightly less successful, and it's not that he was a criminal, but that his story doesn't conform necessarily to the sort of standard Jewish family history of Jews having sort of wonderful family lives, that everything is smooth. Now, this is again slightly in the way of folklore, and I was at a dinner with some cousins, the last remaining cousin in Hull, and his wife wanted to tell me a story about Samuel Gordon, and she said, and another cousin who was there said, no, this story is rubbish. And every time he kept saying it was rubbish, I wanted to hear more. What was going on? And she just said, well, he had another family in Alexandria, had a Muslim wife and many children. So he's got 8 children in Hull, and he's got similar amount of kids in Alexandria. Now this seemed like a really good story. And then it was denounced by my other cousin there by saying, well, it's rubbish, he said, because it was told by a Jewish butcher who smoked. And I thought, well, we talk to our students about what's proof or not proof, but they've never been, if you're a butcher and you smoke, that's the relevance of that was that apparently you would get your meat with a bit of woodbine ash in it. So it was, he was a disreputable figure. But then we managed to trace him because he was in the British. This butcher was in the British Army in Alexandria in 1917, and I know my great grandfather was there, and there's a wonderful photograph of him from 1917 on a camel next to the pyramids, which many other people would have that photograph taken, but it was a real photograph, and so it's not inconceivable. And he was away for 6 months of the year, so he wasn't necessarily breaking the law, or maybe he was, but it's a story of unorthodox behaviour. He went back to Hull and led a very sort of ordinary life afterwards. But I think this is someone you'd think, okay, he's from a quite traditional East European background, father a rabbi, and then we have this photograph of him on a camel wearing a bow tie. This is in the First World War, and a suit, looking perfect English gentleman. And then in Alexandria, he's potentially got this other family. And so there are many, and so that's on the edge of being funny, funny 100 years later. Some of the other stories are remarkable but quite scary. So another Harris, John Harris, becomes, who's of Pedlar origin, becomes a sort of figure of enormous importance in Sierra Leone as a trading figure, controlling huge areas, stimulating wars, sort of almost like Kurtz in the heart of darkness. So from the very, very poor peddler origins becomes this sort of entrepreneur of British imperialism at its most ruthless, and then comes back and lives in retirement in Maida Vale. And there are many other stories like that in the book. Again, look very straightforward on the surface, but we start to dig. And so it is a book about storytelling, not romanticizing any of the figures, but just saying, these don't look at all interesting, but you scratch the surface and there's some incredible stories and adventures within them. I think one of the big challenges of the book was not romanticizing Jacob Harris, that I have sort of lived with him for 10 years. I've not been working solidly on the book, but at least 10 years of imagining all the scenarios, what his background was, and so on. And I make sure that at key points that I don't get into that romantic level. And for one thing where it's tempting is that it's also possible he was a highwayman. Now, highwaymen were brutal figures, though they've got this romantic image. But he was a very skilled horseman. He escapes at dusk, 20 miles on terrible roads, and that's about as far as a horse could go. So so it's not inconceivable he could have been a highwayman. And they say, the first Jewish highwayman or the only Jewish highwayman in history. But I will go back, and say, he's not a hero. Yes, I am rediscovering him from obscurity because no one really has written about him, but I'm not minimizing the horror of what he did. And again, with the scene of the crime, it almost reads like a very bad West End farce. He's half murdered two people, but so he's not very good at murdering people. There must be blood everywhere, and it's a bit like the sort of play that goes wrong. But it doesn't take away from what he did, and it's a possibility that he was a sociopath. I think it's just more likely that he fell out over spoils of smuggling with the landlord, and then thought, well, I'm in the middle of nowhere. If I kill the other two witnesses, not knowing that the first person, Richard Miles, has survived for a few days, I'll get away with it. And so the others were sort of panicked. And that's true of some of the other people. So I'm not, John Harris, this adventure in Sierra Leone, it's almost, you could say, well, my goodness, from obscurity to ruling this massive area, having two African wives of sort of chief leaders, daughters. But no, this was vile. What he was doing cannot be sanitized in any way. And some of the other figures, and some of the people who are sort of Jewish folk heroes like Daniel Mendoza, the boxer, I saw the show. Well, actually, there was another side to Mendoza, that he was beating everyone up, including sort of innocent women who had the audacity to ask for some pennies that he owed them for being his washerwoman. This is not a book of heroes or of villains. It's attempting to contextualize these figures, but not to sort of put a gloss on them. So I don't want there to be a sort of a Jewish heroes calendar with a picture of Jacob Harris at the front. We want sensitivity to understanding where he came from, and his possibly deep background in maybe a criminal underworld in Central Europe in the late 17th century. But at no point do I want to sort of say, well, these Jewish criminals and non-Jewish criminals were in any way sort of figures that we should identify with directly. I think there is a parallel, that this is something that makes the writing of migrant criminality problematic, and perhaps in the Jewish case even more so, that Jews and other groups have been regarded as naturally criminal. In the Jewish case, the sort of religious accusations from the sort of from deicide onwards and ritual murder, and so there is many people are sort of shied away from that, and I'm aware of that issue, and it's still very much with us today, that migrant groups are accused of not just crime, but horrible crimes, and often sexual crimes. When you look at the detailed statistics, which are very tedious, often what they show is that migrant groups are actually less criminal than the world around them, and including in sexual crimes. But that is not the way that the media in its many forms today will represent them. So there is an element of continuity here. And I think it's, in that sense, it's important to humanize these figures, to say that they're not monsters. Jacob Harris was not a monster, as the Victorians described him. He committed a horrible crime, but that doesn't make him unhuman at all. And that's, I think, true today, that we see sort of attacks on hotels where asylum seekers, and horrible things said about them, where there may be one incident in the whole country, and that becomes something to label that whole community. And this has been very close to home to me, just around the corner from where I live. Every Friday night we have these horrendous demonstrations. So there is, but that to me is not an excuse not to look at that, because it is part of the dynamics of all communities. I think I would like them to sort of see the storytelling that ordinary Jewish lives, non-Jewish lives are actually interesting, and that we still have tendency towards sort of elite history. I also want them to take away that migration is part of human nature. The Jewish history, migration has been particularly pronounced, but that's true of all humans, that we move around, and that migration isn't an easy thing, but it enriches us all. So, okay, I've focused on the negative aspect, but that is the nature of human life. And what I've shown essentially is Jewish migrants, through peddling, through crime. The book is incredibly local at one level of where these crimes, this particular crime was committed deep in the Sussex countryside, and incredibly global because it shows the places that these Jewish pedlars and others went to, and it incorporates almost every part of the globe. So there are sections on North Africa, South Africa, in China, the Caribbean, Australia. It covers pretty much every place, and so again, I think place is very important to the book, and it shows that you scratch any local area, and it has got so many different layers of history. So where Jacob Harris was caught in West Hoathly, which is about 20 miles from the scene of the crime, so it's slightly north of Ditchling. This is a place which looks beautiful. It is a beautiful, old, unspoilt English village. But when you scratch the surface, you see so many different layers of history, including migrant history. It has connections to the transatlantic slave trade, very, very powerful ones in terms of one of its local land owners and land landlords, it has connections to the Holocaust. A group of very young survivors are taken to the village to recuperate in 1945. And then it has the story of Jacob Harris and much more mundane migratory stories as well. So that what I hope is, and this is sort of true for Sussex, but it's true for the whole of the United Kingdom, but I think true of everywhere in the world, that no place, however sort of seamless it seems as having no change, is actually full of migratory histories, some of them traumatic and some of them not so.